Chapter 9. After breakfast, the girls headed to Take Note, which was the dopest place to buy school supplies, according to Ruby. Not the sickest? Clover asked. Ruby nodded. That too, she said. Clover grinned. She couldn't wait to tell her fellow star darling she'd picked up a new wishling word. At Take Note, Clover gazed around in astonishment. Paper. There were notebooks, pads, stationery, envelopes, and stacks of paper everywhere. Unbelievable. And what about those things called binders? How did wishling students fit them into their backpacks? They were so large and bulky. Everything in the store was strange and fascinating, especially those writing sticks called highlighters that disappointingly didn't even light up. She and Ruby loaded up their carts, and Ruby declared they were done. Mrs. Marshall met them by the checkout, where employees stood behind clunky machines and customers passed them small plastic cards to pay with. The line snaked almost to the back of the store. While they waited, Ruby's mom reminisced about her first day of high school, back before students used what she referred to as laptops. Ruby rolled her eyes, but Clover noticed she was actually listening. Finally, they were next. Clover, who had no wishling money, had a plan. She faked receiving a text. "Look at that," she said. "Good old Mom. She already bought all my supplies for me." She turned to Ruby. "Now I don't have to carry them home." "That's ill of her." Ruby gave her a funny look. "I think you mean sick." "Of course," said Clover. "Totally dumb." "Dope," corrected Ruby's mother. She laughed. "Guess I've been paying attention." Mother and daughter checked out, while Clover put all her school supplies back. She wished she could have kept the pack of loose leaf, with its straight lines and perfectly placed holes, or the purple composition notebook. That was hard to return to the rack. "Mom," said Ruby, as they left the store, "can you take my stuff home so Clover and I can hang out a little here?" Ruby's mom paused. "I don't think so," she said. "I have to get back and I don't want you to walk home alone. I'll just drive you back." Clover got into the back seat, and Ruby slid next to her. "My mom won't let me sit up front," she explained. "Still, my cousins are allowed to, and they're younger than me. I bet even the ones in preschool will beat me to the front." During the drive, Clover shared her idea with Ruby, whispering so Mrs. Marshall wouldn't hear babysitting, money, bank account. "Sounds good," Ruby agreed happily, speaking in a low voice. "My neighbor, Mrs. Howard, has little twin girls. They're adorable. And she just told my mom that her babysitter moved away, and she's looking for a new one." "Sounds perfect," said Clover. Mrs. Marshall dropped them off in front of Ruby's house, then went to run more errands. "At least she leaves me home alone," Ruby grumbled. "Finally." "Let's go talk to your neighbor now," Clover suggested, glancing worriedly at her countdown clock. "You can line up a babysitting job, and then we can tell your mother your plan." Ruby agreed. Mrs. Howard was in her backyard. She was holding a hose as two little girls in bathing suits ran around in the spray. They were about 3 Wishworld years old, Clover guessed, with short curly hair and little round bellies. They weren't identical, but they looked very much alike. Ruby waved to Mrs. Howard. "Won't be too many more summer days," the woman said, as Ruby and Clover walked closer. "I want to get them outside as much as possible." "Oh, sure," said Ruby. She introduced Clover, then explained that they were available for babysitting. "Great," Mrs. Howard said, putting down the hose. "If you're free right now, I could really use the help. I need to go to the grocery store, and it's so much easier without the girls." Clover looked at the wee wishlings. The girls were little angels, really, playing together nicely and amusing themselves. The babysitting job would be a snap. Moments later, Mrs. Howard left, while the girls, Joelle and Michaela, waved goodbye cheerfully. The first hour was a breeze. Ruby and the girls played games with funny names like Red Rover, Freeze Tag, and Kick the Can. The girls then decided to run through the sprinkler, so Ruby turned it back on. The twins laughed and shouted with glee. One of the girls busied herself next to the sprinkler. Then Joelle stood up with the hose in her hand. "Let's play!" she cried. The next thing Clover knew, the nozzle, which must have been loose, fell off. The hose began to snake and buck like Clover's shooting star. The little girl was having trouble holding onto it. "My turn!" shouted Michaela, grabbing the hose too. They both spun around as the hose twisted and turned, soaking first Ruby, then Clover, then spraying a stream of water right into the house through an open window. The girls fell to the ground and rolled over each other, crushing a neat row of flowers and coating themselves in a thick layer of mud. The hose slipped out of their hands and continued to spray the yard. Joelle and Michaela burst into tears. The yard was a muddy mess. So were they. Clover and Ruby stood frozen in place, looks of panic on their faces. It had all happened so quickly, they hadn't even had time to move. And now Clover didn't have the starriest idea what to do. Her littlest relatives would be thrilled to have a muddy playground, and a little water never fazed them. They'd be laughing, not crying. Suddenly, Ruby went into action. She raced to the side of the house and turned off the faucet. The hose slowed to a dribble, then stopped. She scooped up both muddy girls, then held them tight and murmured comforting words. There. It's all right. You're okay. It's fine." The girls quieted, sniffled a bit, then stopped crying altogether when Ruby tickled them. "Okay," Ruby said cheerfully, setting them on the ground. "Let's see what we can do to clean up around here." "Don't want to clean up." Joelle opened her mouth to cry again, but Ruby said quickly, "Did I say clean up? I meant, what can we do to have fun around here? I say let's turn on the hose again, on low, and watch all that mud disappear from your bodies." She waved at Clover to twist the faucet and held the hose carefully away from the twins as she splashed water on them. They laughed hysterically. Then she moved the lawn furniture around so the muddy spaces would be in direct sunlight. "That should dry pretty fast," she said. Next, Ruby led Michaela and Joelle to the garden area, gave them shovels, and showed them how to pat down the mud and dirt while she replanted the flowers. Clover edged over to Ruby and whispered, "What about all the water that went inside?" Ruby nodded. "Now," she said, standing up, "let's check out your house and see what we can do there." Everyone wiped their feet on the doormat. Then they stepped through the door and into the living room. It doesn't look good, Clover thought. Toys had been knocked over by the blast. Water still dripped from the open window, and there were puddles of water on the wood floor. The place was a disaster. Clover didn't even know where to begin, and meanwhile the girls were racing around, making even more of a mess. Ruby found some small towels in the linen closet and showed the twins how to house skate by placing their tiny feet on the towels and sliding around, mopping up the wet floor. They thought it was great fun. Meanwhile, Clover dried and organized the scattered toys. "Now what, Ruby?" asked Michaela as she handed Ruby her towel. "We skate in the kitchen? Wash that floor?" "The girls want to clean?" Mrs. Howard said, walking in at that moment. "Ruby, you're incredible!" "Ruby is a real gem," Clover giggled, remembering Wishworld jewels. But she meant it, too. Her wisher had taken charge, and clearly the little girls loved her. Mrs. Howard paid Ruby with paper money, thanking her again while the twins begged her to come back and play. Smiling, Ruby and Clover left through the back door. They paused for a moment, admiring the good-as-new backyard. "Now," Clover said, switching gears for the next step of her wish-granting plan. "We just find a bank, hurry over, and set up an account for you." "Slow down," Ruby laughed. "The nearest bank is about 3 miles away, and we can't just walk in and open an account." "You can't?" Clover asked. Ruby pulled up some information on her phone and showed it to Clover. "Oh no," Clover groaned. "You need to be accompanied by a parent with proof of address plus identification." "Can we manage all this?" she asked Ruby. "Well, my mom could go with us," said Ruby, "but we'd have to ask. And if we really need ID, I'd have to wait until school starts. They hand them out on the first day." "When is the first day again?" Clover asked. "Thursday." That meant next to nothing to Clover. How many days from today? Maybe if it was the next day, they could work things out. "Today's Monday, so in 3 days." Clover sighed. That was way too late. Her plan was too complicated. It would take too long to complete, she realized. Why did she always do that? Just like the circus idea and the trip to Mount Glint. She made everything too involved. She wanted so much to succeed, to prove herself. And she thought the more complicated the plan, the better and smarter it was. Then Clover remembered the words she'd heard at the beginning of her journey to Wish World. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most powerful one. She hadn't been thinking simply, but maybe she could now. "Simplify," Clover told herself. "Simplify." Just then, Ruby's phone rang. She looked at the screen and then quickly put it away. "It's just my mom," she said. "Ruby, answer it," said Clover. "Talk to her." Reluctantly, Ruby swiped the screen. "Hi, Mom." Mrs. Marshall's voice came through the speaker loud and clear. "Where are you?" she said in a panic. "You're supposed to be at home." "Mom, calm down. I'm just next door. I was babysitting Michaela and Joelle." "What? Why didn't you ask permission? Why didn't you?" "Mom, I'm hanging up. I'll be right home." Ruby hung up and didn't move. Her mouth turned down in a pout. "I can't believe she doesn't trust me when here I am babysitting, earning my own money. She doesn't get it." Across the yard, Clover could see Mrs. Marshall peering anxiously from her back door. This is definitely not helping, Clover thought. Ruby is proving she's the opposite of mature and responsible. She should have told Ruby to ask her mom about the babysitting, and Ruby should have asked her about the hair color too, before she dyed it. She didn't talk to her, so of course her mom got angry. Now she'd never get her wish, unless Clover could come up with another idea. Something simple and... Ruby interrupted her thoughts, saying, "Let's go to my room. I'll show you the outfit I want to wear on the first day of school. Of course, I'll have to show it to you online, because my mom won't buy it for me." "Okay." Clover wouldn't give up. She'd stay on Wish World with Ruby until the very last star sec. Together, the girls went into Ruby's house. Mrs. Marshall was nowhere to be seen, but the door to the master bedroom was closed tight. Ruby opened her door and walked inside, but Clover stood in the doorway in shock. Ruby's bedroom looked like a star clone had blown right through it. Clothes littered the floor like a second carpet. Every surface was covered with papers. Clover could barely see the desk, dresser, or nightstand. Drawers hung half open, with more clothes falling out of them. A jumble of shoes, blankets, and coats spilled out of the closet. The garbage can overflowed onto the rug. Dirty dishes were piled on the desk. Clover couldn't even bring herself to walk into the room. Maybe she would just wait outside. Come in, said Ruby. Make yourself at home. Gingerly, Clover took a step forward. She edged closer to the window, over to a teeny tiny clear space. Peering outside, she saw a girl with bright orange hair walking down the street. Could that be Gemma here to help? Clover thought excitedly. She hoped against hope it was the Star Darling. She desperately needed her. The girl drew closer, and Clover realized it was just an ordinary wishling, not a transformed starling. But now that she thought about it, she realized her Star Darling helper should be there any starsec. Her mission was definitely in trouble. Clover couldn't pull herself away from the window, just in case she spotted a starling. What was happening on Starland anyway? Surely Piper must have told Lady Cordial about the mission, and Lady Cordial must know that it was going terribly wrong, and reinforcements were needed. Then Clover's heart sank with a realization. Maybe Lady Cordial didn't know what was going on because of the lack of energy. Maybe Clover had to figure it out all by herself. Clover slumped and yawned. Quickly, she recited her mirror mantra in her head. Keep the beat and shine like the star you are. Twice. Even without a mirror, she felt a bit better. She was just about to think it a third time when Mrs. Marshall came to the door. Ruby Marshall, she said in a firm voice. We really need to talk. You need to tell me where you're going. Do you know how worried I was when I came home and you weren't here? It's important that I know your plans, in case of an emergency. Then she turned to Clover. You'll have to leave now, Clover. Ruby is grounded. She can't have friends over. This was getting worse and worse. What was she going to do? She turned and looked into the woman's eyes. I can still stay here. It's okay. You can still stay here, Mrs. Marshall repeated in a dull voice. It's okay. Then she sniffed the air. Does anyone else smell chocolate fudge cookies? She asked, then left before Clover or Ruby could answer. Wow, said Ruby. That was weird. It doesn't matter, Clover told her. And you know, don't you, that your mom is kind of right? She just worries about you, that's all. And she wants you to talk to her. Maybe if you did, she'd be more open to hearing about your ideas about your hair and clothes. Ruby looked at her thoughtfully, considering. Giving Ruby time to think, Clover pushed aside some books and sat on the edge of the bed. She hadn't even had a starsec to come up with a new, simple plan. How much time did she have left? She opened her countdown clock. Starf! She was down to 15 Wish World minutes. She didn't see how the mission was even possible anymore. Clover heard sounds from downstairs, voices raised in greeting. Mrs. Marshall saying, "Hello, dear." Ruby's dad must be home. Ugh, said Ruby, as her phone vibrated with a text. My mom's still not leaving me alone. She turned the screen so Clover could see the message. Dad agrees. You're grounded, and don't leave your room until it's clean. That would be one way to prove you're responsible. Aha! Clover leaped to her feet. Cleaning the room would be a simple solution, an easy way for Ruby to show her maturity. Clover didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She had the answer. But there wouldn't be enough time to clean up. The room was a wreck. Clover sighed. It was really too bad. Ruby was so close to achieving her wish. She was a terrific, responsible babysitter, and she seemed to be seriously thinking over Clover's advice about talking to her mom. But Clover was out of time. She turned, smiling sadly at Ruby. "I need to go home." "Can't you stay longer?" Ruby pleaded. "I wish I could." Clover shook her head, upset. "If only I could make time stand still." She laughed bitterly. For everyone but us, of course. For a moment, she visualized time actually standing still, everything coming to a halt, cars and buses stopping, Michaela and Joelle standing in front of the sprinkler, still as statues, the water frozen in place. "Goodbye, Ruby." Then, before Ruby could say a word, Clover slipped out of the room, leaving the wish ungranted.